Hello. So for this video, I'd like to cover three distinct but very much related topics: sampling, resampling, and drum racks. I decided to cover all three of them in just the basics as a set because I consider them to be a related set of tools that you're frequently going to be drawing on to create sounds in Ableton. You may be sampling something, then you resample it, you throw it into a drum rack, you create a copy of that, sample that again, put it in another drum rack, and in this way you can create lots of different related sounds. So before I get started, I'd just like to give maybe three brief definitions. Sampling can have many different definitions, but particularly for Ableton, I consider sampling to be the recording of a segment of sound, typically for use in further processing, for repetition, and other types of arrangement that you might use it for. Resampling, in particular for Ableton, is useful to distinguish between sampling and resampling because Ableton provides you with the facility for selecting resampling as an input. And resampling basically just means recording what's playing in Ableton. So you might have a sound, you add a bunch of different effects to it, you select resampling on another audio track, and boom, you've recorded what you were playing in Ableton, and then you can do something with that. A drum rack is, of course, used for playing drums in Ableton, but I hope to illustrate with this video that drum racks can be used for a whole lot more than just drums. They're kind of a vehicle for you to play lots of different samplers and sampling instruments simultaneously, and a way for you to kind of build a playground with samples, which is how I typically use the drum racks for. So let's go into Ableton and get started and just explore the sampling facilities. So what I've done here is I've gone into instruments, and in Simpler I've chosen one of the pads. You don't necessarily need sampler unless you're building a complex instrument from scratch, like you have a 17th century harpsichord. I don't know if they were around then, but let's say you have an old instrument and you want to make a detailed representation of it. You can use something like Contact or Sampler to build a multi-sample library, but we're not going into that here. For our purposes, we're going to use Simpler, and Simpler just plays back a sample with the parameters that you've desired, and depending on your MIDI input, it will take that input and it can repitch it by playing back the sound at different speeds, and it has other algorithms for interpolating sounds depending on what key you want to play in. So here's a pad sound. I can draw this in as a note, and you'll hear it repitched, hopefully. So you should get the picture from that. There's a lot you can do just with this one instrument. So you'll notice that it has arrows on each side. This controls the size of the sample, but not the duration. This just shows you the beginning and end of the sample. So for example, you'll hear the sound of the boundaries to the point where if I make it really, really short, it doesn't even really know how to play the full, it doesn't have the full waveform at its disposal. For this, you'll also have the ADSR envelope and the volume to play around with. So if I make this a full sample and I want it to have more of a swell sound, I can adjust the attack time to be very long. It's not quite a one-shot, so you're not going to hear the decay until I depress my key. The release. Yeah, the release time is what I was referring to when you actually release the key. And then you have a filter that you can play around with. Then you can go into controls. You can also play with the filter here, and then add an LFO to it. And use the LFO to modulate the filter, or modulate the pitch. But if you put it at a very, very low pitch modulation, you can get that kind of rough approximation of like the tape warble, that sort of thing, like a Boards of Canada type sound. Okay, so that's the basic of the simpler instrument. You'll notice that Ableton has at your disposal a sample library that you can use. You can drag any of these in to Sampler. I guess one more thing I'd just like to illustrate with Simpler is you can reverse the sample, and it's going to be quite difficult to hear with this, so what I'd like to do is take something that has a long decay to it. So you can achieve swell sounds for this kind of thing using reverse. Okay, now reverse. Particularly if I lower the pitch of the sample by transposing my keyboard down an octave, I can make the playback slower and proceed through the waveform from the point of decay all the way to its onset. You can reverse back and forth. You could make copies of your sample and do reverses, and there's all sorts of things you can do with reversing. Okay. So let's talk about resampling a little bit. For resampling, before you even put it into a sampler instrument, you'll want to create a new audio track and select resampling in the audio from panel. It's really like the input. Audio from input, audio to output. And all this is going to do is it's going to record whatever you're playing in Ableton. So for example, I want to arm the record button. Let's see. Yeah, and all this is doing, it just recorded that clip, re-recorded that into a waveform, and now I can crop that. Take the gain on it up a little bit. Then I can create a new MIDI track with an empty Simpler instance, and I can drag that clip into here. If I solo this track, I should be able to hear something, although it's probably very quiet. Not particularly musical, but you get the idea here that we're basically recording what's happening inside Ableton, putting it in a clip, and then dropping it into a simpler instrument. Okay. So let's get rid of these, and I just want to wrap it up with a little intro to how to use drum racks. So just to, the basics of it, is that typically in Ableton you'll go into drums and you'll select something like a 707 or something similar, and you'll notice that this here is a drum rack. Well, what happens inside a drum rack? Here it looks like each one of the drums has an instance of Simpler inside it. there are some macro controls that we don't need to go over, but each one of these drums is its own sample. So in this way, we're basically playing back a collection of samples and using the drum rack to play the drums. But you could put really anything in here. So we can just go into samples here. They're not organized at all. Yay. All right, cool. That's weird enough. Okay, so I've dragged some samples into here. You'll notice that some of them are still looping. You can stop that like this. You can also, yeah, you can select it as a one shot, and let's see how this thing does. What's this? Oh, this is a very long sample. It's playing through the whole thing, and we haven't actually selected an onset and offset of it. So anyway. So that's one way you can use the drum racks, is you can arrange your samples and play them like drums. And if you only want one of them playing at a time, you can use these choke groups here. Select all of them in this case. And basically, they'll behave in the same way that a choke would on a hi-hat, in the sense that it only has two states, open and closed, open and closed. So in this way, you can make samples not overlay each other. You could also make specific choke groups so that if there are related samples that you don't want to play over each other, you can have them assign them to their own choke group. So I think that covers the very, very basics of sampling, resampling in Ableton, and making drum kits. And have fun. Thanks.